Hi, Misha here, and honestly, after a lot of time and work, I've finally been able to assemble a few Russian, well, rarely Soviet Russian fighters from World War II in 1/72 scale diecast. It's not an easy task, so I'm going to be doing a 3-part video, and in part 1, we're actually going to look at the Polikarpov I-16 and the MiG-3. At first, these two might not seem related, but in reality, they actually are. And then from there, we'll look at some other fighters. But first, let's go back to the 1930s. The I-16, or some say E-16, the brainchild of Nikolai Polikarpov, a gentleman who had a rocky relationship with Stalin, to say the least. He was originally kind of in favor. He did some early work with reconnaissance aircraft and training aircraft, but by 1930-31, even though he'd been tasked to develop a fighter, it was perceived to be going too slow, and he was actually scheduled to be shot. But I think that was maybe just motivation. It's one way to do it, I suppose. He did come up with the I-15, which was a biplane that went into production. And really before it was even fully in the field, he introduced the concept of the I-16 here, a monowing aircraft of wood and metal construction. And really, when it flew in December of 1933, it was really advanced. It had a retracting landing gear, at least the front gear. The original version had a sliding canopy, so an enclosed cockpit. It was short and stubby, which was the point. It only about 20 feet long and just under 30 feet in wingspan, and it was very fast for the day and time. It was also the lightest production fighter, at least in the mid-1930s. And it would first fly in 1933 and go through state testing in 34, first kind of be shown to the public. There would be some revisions. The Type 1s would be pre-production. The Type 5 would be the first full production model. At that time, they were just armed with two 7.62 millimeter machine guns. But then they would soon upgrade the engine, giving it a top speed of nearly 300 miles per hour. And it was actually quite advanced for that time, the mid-1930s. Unfortunately, this was also the time of rapid advancement. And they would get a chance to go into combat at the end of 1936 when several would be sent to Spain to fight on the Republican side in the Civil War. And one of the first issues they noticed was that 2 machine guns were just not enough. So with the Type 6, they would introduce a total of 3 machine guns. And with the Type 10, they would introduce 4. And then later, with the Type 12, it would be the first Soviet fighter to be armed with cannon. And it would have 2 20mm cannon, one in each wing, and it would still retain the 2 .30 caliber machine guns in the cowling here. Now, it was not a perfect aircraft, and unfortunately this was just a time of rapid technological advancement. Now you'll notice this model here, which is actually from Motor City, although it's, basically the old IXO tooling, has an open cockpit. They actually removed the enclosed canopy because there were several issues. Pilots worried about it opening and closing when they didn't want it to. The quality of glass was kind of meh, and it tended to fog up, smoke up due to oil and other, burning things, making it hard to see through. So they just kind of did away with it, except for, of course, the front windscreen. They also had some trouble with the early manually cranked landing gear. The tail wheel would always just be down, but front gear would come up. And they did their best to improve it, going to more powerful engines. And the idea in the 30s in Russia was that the I-15, the biplane, was more maneuverable. The I-16, well, it was there for climb and overall top speed. And in the very beginning in Spain, they showed quite well. But then as newer versions of the Bf-109 came in, at first they were kind of equal, and then newer versions of the Messerschmitt with more powerful engines just completely outstripped the Polikarpov here. Nevertheless, nearly 300 were sent to Spain, although nearly 200 were lost. And at the end of the war on April 1st, 1939, several things happened. Most importantly, Stalin called a conference in Moscow, inviting pretty much all the design bureaus to submit new fighter designs. That's because the Russian Air Force, the VVS, had decided that they'd push this design about as far as they really could. While it was quite modern and advanced for 1934, already by 1939, it was about as good as it was going to get. And no surprise, yet again, Polikarpov was out of favor with Stalin because apparently he couldn't future-proof his design. I know, how dare he not be able to, make a futuristic plane. So his design group was actually broken up towards the end of that year, and he was pretty much put into forcible retirement. But you know what? At least he wasn't shot. So there was at least a little bit of residual, something. I hate to give anything to Stalin, but yeah, he had just mood swings. But yeah, nevertheless, these were still in production before and at the beginning of the Second World War. In fact, when Operation Barbarossa took place, over 1,600 were still in active Soviet Air Force service, although about half of those were destroyed by July of 1941, so yeah. But they were still in frontline service throughout 1941 and into 1942, and even though they were more or less hopelessly outclassed by the Messerschmitts, sometimes pilots would resort to ramming techniques. The one thing they had over the Messerschmitt, generally speaking, they still were more maneuverable, and because of their smaller size, could be a little more of an evasive target, but in every other way, the Messerschmitt would outgun and outfly the I-16. And they would actually build nearly 7,000 single-seaters and over 3,000 two-seat trainers. And production would not be completely halted until 1943. Even some were assembled from parts and whatnot into 44. But really by 42, it was, known to be an old design. And as soon as they could, with the end of the war, they removed this from frontline service. The only other place this served of note was in China. About 250 were sent to China in 1938, 1939. And there they went up against the A5M, as well as the Key 27, and proved to be an adequate match. But then when newer aircraft like the A6M, the Zero, came on the scene, yet again it was totally outclassed. Now you might be wondering, how does the I-16 relate to the MiG? Why did I put them in the same video together? Well, that's because the MiG really started off as a Polikarpov design. At the beginning of 1939, really right before Stalin had his Moscow invite conference, the VVS had already specified requirements for a new high-altitude fighter, i.e. Interceptor. The I-16, for what it was, could actually achieve over 30,000 feet. Not too shabby, frankly. But, yeah, things were changing rapidly. I should also point out that the I-16 was one of the first aircraft to actually be fitted with rockets under the wings. It was used a little bit in Spain and whatnot. So it was a pioneering aircraft. And so at the beginning for this new VVS aircraft, the Polikarpov Bureau started the process of design around June of 1939, and it was designated as the I-200. I was, or E again, could be I or E, kind of the designation for fighter in Russia. But Polikarpov was out of favor, so between August and November, Stalin kind of conspired to take the design bureau away from him. And in November, two individuals kind of were assigned to take over the I-200 project, Mikoyan and Gavrilovich. And that's where we get MiG. Although in the beginning, they were still subordinate to the Polikarpov Bureau. But this wouldn't last long. The team would become independent that June. But they did inherit the I-200 design, which was meant to be a high-altitude interceptor. So let's fast forward a bit. The VVS really needed modern fighters in 1940. So even though the I-200 had some problems and barely passed state trials, it did have some promise. It was actually quite fast at altitude, over 400 miles per hour, and it could achieve a maximum altitude of nearly 40,000 feet. But early on, it was just armed with two 7.62 millimeter 30 caliber machine guns and one 12.7 or 50 caliber machine gun. It also had somewhat limited range, and like the I-16, it suffered from kind of lax QC and poor cockpit visibility, other things of that nature. Nevertheless, they needed them, so they put them into production. They did implement a few changes between the prototypes and the production, MiG-1 as it would soon be known, but most would have to wait. I would say the most noteworthy change, they were able to wrap the fuel tanks in rubber, giving them some self-sealing capability, and they were in full production, at least for a brief time. They would build 3 prototypes and 100 production models. And in November of 1940, the Russian system was changed. Instead of using I, they would start naming aircraft after their designers. This is where MiG comes from. The name MiG-1 was given retroactively to the I-200 in December of 1940, but by this time, what would soon be known as the MiG-3 came to be, with the 4th prototype built, which first flew at the end of October 1940. We had many changes that brought us this aircraft. I'm not going to list them all out here, but some included an additional fuel tank, additional oil tank. They moved the engine back a bit, extended the fuselage just a bit. The MiG-1 was just under 27 feet long. The MiG-3 was just over 27. Both of them had a wingspan of about 33.5 feet. They would also add additional armament, at least later on in MiG-3 production, and make some other changes like giving an armored headrest for the pilot, improving the glazing for the canopy, and eventually they would add a radio, although Russian radios were kind of rubbish at this point in the war, or really before the war for Russia. But anyway, the 4th prototype became the first MiG-3, and on December 20th, the MiG-1 was officially replaced on the production line by the MiG-3, and by the end of that year, they were able to deliver 21 of them. All in all, the MiG-3 was an improvement over the MiG-1. but it wasn't entirely so. The MiG-1 was a little bit faster at altitude. The MiG-3 was slightly slower, just under 400 miles per hour. It also had a slightly lower ceiling of about 39,000 feet, but it also had longer range, and it tended to be faster at medium altitudes. And it was better armed and armored, so it was kind of all in all, it was a net gain. But the MiG was kind of a failure, and also one of the best aircraft of World War II, at least in 1941. So this went through state trials at the beginning of 1941, and already the command economy in Russia ordered that factory number 1 build 3,500 in 1941, and they actually were meeting and even succeeding this goal, at least until, well, Nazis. But it had issues, and here's the problem. This was a high-altitude interceptor, but most combat after June 22nd was at low altitude, and at that, this was outclassed by the Bf-109 and other German aircraft. So where it really was good, there wasn't much fighting going on. And they tried making the MiG-1 and the MiG-3 into ground attackers. Well, they were pretty bad at that. They could carry a bomb under each wing, about 100 kilograms, or up to 6 rockets. Now this model here is of a later MiG-3, and you can tell that because it has 2 additional machine guns. It has a 12.7 inch, 12.7 millimeter, under each wing, for a total of 5 machine guns, 2 30 cals and 3 50 cals. Also with the MiG-3, they did increase the ammo capacity of the machine guns. One fun fact, the rear landing gear, unlike the I-16, was meant to be retractable, but they had problems with this, not an uncommon problem for early retracting landing gear, and so with most later production ones, they would literally just fix it in the down position. So, they made 100 MiG-1s, and ultimately they would build just over 3,400 MiG-3s, all throughout 1941. And the last about 3 dozen MiG-3s would be delivered at the very beginning of 1942, and that would be it. This is because the factory was ordered to switch from MiG-3 production to IL-2 production. It was felt to be more necessary to the war at that point. Nevertheless, of course, they served. The MiG-1s would serve. Actually, there would be a couple up till 1944. And the MiG-3s, well, there were over 1,000 in the VVS during Operation Barbarossa, but there were only about 500 trained pilots on these because these were pretty difficult to fly aircraft. Now, they were not entirely metal. They were composite wood and metal, but they were pretty high performance. But to be fair, the I-16 was pretty high performance for its day and time, too. So they were difficult to fly and very challenging for pilots. This earned them kind of a mixed reputation, to say the least. But only 100 MiG-1s. A lot of those, yeah, they didn't, they just kind of got scattered about. The MiG-3 was used a lot in 1941 and into 42. However, the VVS would quickly transfer its to the Russian Navy, as well as the PVO, the Russian Air Self-Defense Forces. So they were kind of put in second-line service already by this point. And even then, by 1944, the Navy had retired all of theirs, transferring them to the PVO. And that's really the agency that had the most use for a high-altitude interceptor. because it was more focused on, well, defense against bombers and what have you, not ground attack and everything else. So a very short career in production, and even a pretty short career in service. By 1945, by the beginning of the year, even the PVO had retired its MiG-3s because, again, a lot of them were lost, a lot of them were damaged. Production had long since been over. And also, by this point, there was like one MiG-1 still hanging out. So, not a huge number there. So kind of humble beginnings for a design bureau that would go on to great acclaim and fame in the jet era. Now the MiG-1 really wasn't their design, and the MiG-3 was just a modification of it, yet their fingerprints were all on it, especially for performance. So that kind of leads into that jet era, and certainly an aircraft worth talking about, because really in 1941, the MiG-3 in a lot of ways was a higher performing aircraft than, say, the Spitfire or even the current models of the Bf-109, the Messerschmitt. So it was pretty ambitious. I mean, 400 miles per hour was nothing to sneeze at, but that was only at altitude. At sea level, because of its design, it struggled to get much past 300 miles per hour. And therein kind of lied the problem. And maneuverability was meh at best. But it did show that Russia was willing and able to innovate. Again, these two models, they're both from the old IXO tooling. The gear are up or down for this one. Propeller spins. And this here is from De Agostini, and it has much the same features: gear up or down, spinning propeller. One kind of interesting fact to note, it doesn't come with the ability to display the rear gear up. It just has the late war down position. But again, since it has the late war, or not late war, but I should say late production, extra machine guns on the wings, fair enough, I suppose. I'm just happy to have a MiG, because before the only ones I could find were the plastic easy models, and at least this is die-cast metal, even if it is from one of the more economy lines. So yeah, there you have it, guys. What do you think? The first MiGs, really? And Russia's attempts to modernize the Air Force. And next time, we'll kind of see a different design aesthetic. The shellacked, the wooden coffin. Anyway, that's for then. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon, Stalin willing, next time.